Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to the Neofusionist Book Review. This is not your typical book review, as I make no claims to political or philosophical impartiality. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the premise of neofusionism. Neofusionism is the merging of paleoconservatism with naturalism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. For today's episode, we will be looking at a book called America First: Its History, Culture, and Politics, written by Bill Kauffman and published in 1995. Now, the version that I have is a reprint of the book that came out in 2016. So it came out at the height of the 2016 election, before the vote. So there's an epilogue at the end of the book where he talks a little bit about the 2016 election, and he talks a little bit about Donald Trump. I thought it was very interesting, but I'm not going to get into that section. We'll have more to say about Donald Trump in some later episodes. But what I want to get to in this book, well, let me kind of talk a little bit about this book and the way it's presented. There are a number of individuals, historical figures, that he focuses on. And he kind of moves through time, starts with the early 20th century and winds his way toward Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot and Jerry Brown, the people that he talks about who are active in the 1990s when the book was written. So it kind of walks through the whole 20th century in a way, but it tends to focus more on the early 20th century, which is why I found this book interesting, because I find that period of American history interesting, and particularly that period of politics, and what the Republican Party looked like, and what conservatism looked like, and what individualism looked like, etc., etc. It was all very interesting, and he focuses on that. So it's called America First. Now, there was an America First committee, and that's kind of a rough basis for what this book is about. It's really kind of about the concept of America First, but it focuses a little bit on the America First Committee that was opposed to entry into World War II. And some of the figures that he discusses were, in some greater or lesser extent, involved with that committee. Not all of them, but some of them. And every chapter where he talks about a person, or in some chapters, like there's a chapter on writers, and there's a chapter on movie makers in this kind of New Deal World War II era. And generally, he talks about dissidents. He talks about people who were opposed to the New Deal and who were opposed to entry into World War II. People who were opposed to the Cold War, although not as much, because that's a little bit later. Every chapter, there are, in addition to the main character or the main characters, there are a whole host of other characters. There are a whole host of cultural references. It's kind of like swimming through this mud of American culture, which is really interesting to read. I'm not sure how it's going to translate when I read it out loud. I think to some extent it will translate okay, and to some extent you'll be like, wait, who's that? Wait, what? Who? What? He's very knowledgeable about American history and American popular culture and political culture. And so, there's some things where he's referencing something that he's brought up at an earlier point in time, or at an earlier point in the book. There are some things that he references that it's just a passing reference, and unless you are as knowledgeable as he is, you're not going to know what he's talking about, which is fine. That's just kind of how this book reads. But it's kind of like, okay, well, what's the thread tying this all together? Not even policies are necessarily coherently attached from one person to another. It's more of well, it's largely anti-war and dissident, but it's more than that. It's a localism, a populism, a nationalism, a sense of, well, like I had said, it talked about in previous episodes, it's like a sense of home. The people that he talks about have a sense of home. They're not internationalists. They're nationalists, they're localists, they're decentralists. And so there's kind of an appreciation of the working man and woman, an appreciation of smallness. It's almost an aesthetic sort of thing that ties all these characters and authors that he talks about together. And so there are a few sections here that I'm going to read, as usual. I'm going to start with some stuff from I'm going to start with some stuff from the preface, because I think it kind of lays out the scenario, sort of. Now, the preface was written in the second edition, written in 2016. It was added to the book. But I think it kind of nicely says a little bit about where he's coming from, so we can know a little bit about the author. And I think the author, Bill Kauffman, this is the only book of his that I've read. I would like to look at some of his other stuff, because I feel like it all follows this same sort of direction. And I think it's an important thing for us who are kind of trying to figure out where the Republican Party goes from here, and have a sense of this nationalist direction, and want to make it work, to know who our heroes are, who our authors are, who our thinkers are, and to have a sense of how we are connected into the greater culture and the greater history. So I'm just going to jump right in and read this section from the preface so that you can kind of get an idea of where he's coming from. He says, quote, "The reader deserves to know my own biases. As I wrote in Look Homeward, America, my politics are localist, decentralist, Jeffersonian. I am an American rebel, a Main Street bohemian, a rural Christian pacifist. I have strong libertarian and traditionalist conservative streaks. I am for peace, the Bill of Rights, and the local. Voting behavior is an unreliable, if not downright poor index of anything beyond momentary caprice, but I cast my ballot for Bernie Sanders in April 2016. I have no idea what I'll do in November. Over the years, I have voted in primary and general presidential elections for Ralph Nader, Pat Buchanan, Ross Perot, Jesse Jackson, Ron Paul, Barack Obama, and Gary Johnson, the peace candidates. The single most consequential and dispiriting change in American political culture since this book's publication has been the virtual disappearance of a widespread commitment, even if only rhetorical, to freedom of speech. When I was a boy, we used what seemed a hackneyed phrase to justify contrary opinions or actions. It's a free country. No one says that anymore because it's not true. The uncompromising defenders of free, robust, even profane speech who made me a teenage liberal, William O. Douglas, Lenny Bruce, Roger Baldwin, Allen Ginsberg, are airless. The narrowing bounds of acceptable opinion are now patrolled not by FBI agents or scolding Mrs. Grundys, but by nasty and humorless social justice ideologues, with the desiccated souls of concentration camp guards. They are, to use a phrase that would set off enough trigger warnings to close Oberlin College for good, un-American. America, like the good gray poet of Camden, who counseled, "Resist much, obey little," contains multitudes, is self-contradictory, unruly, tolerant in a way that the hall monitors and tattletales of mandatory tolerance can never understand. It embraces the prickly. It listens to the cacophonous. It may hector and holler and heckle, but it will not shut you up. That's what Nazis and Trotskyites do. Alas, these censorious thugs have found in anti-social media their true métier. America First, as a tendency or allegiance, must stem from a love of one's own country, not the disparagement of others. If I love my own place, its history and cuisine and topography and music and even its foibles and its sins, then I must understand and respect others who love their own places." End quote. So that's kind of a nice explanation of where he's coming from, and you'll find that he mentioned one of the things he said about himself was a Main Street bohemian and an American rebel. A little bit different than what you might expect. There are points in here when he talks about his affinity for punk rock music and beat poetry. Allen Ginsberg he mentions. He talks about Jack Kerouac in this book. It's not what you would necessarily expect to find from your straight-laced conservative, and I don't think he is a straight-laced conservative. He voted for Bernie Sanders, obviously. I'm going to assume that was in some Democratic primary, either the most recent one, or the 2016 one, or maybe he lives in Vermont. I don't really know. But he voted for Barack Obama and Bernie Sanders, but he also voted for Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul. He voted for Ross Perot, Gary Johnson. He's a libertarian, but he's also a communitarian. He's a nationalist in his own way. And he views nationalism and libertarianism and localism and decentralism aesthetically as much as he does politically. He is in favor of the agrarian. And we're going to find out a little bit more about how he views politics and life as we go through this book. But I think it's interesting that it's not just a set of policies. It is a sense of love of place. And like I talked about previously, it's a sense of home. As I said in some of my previous podcasts, how important a sense of being home, feeling like the place where you are is your home. And that doesn't mean that you accept everything for just the way it is regardless, but it's a sort of rootedness in place and in the natural environment that surrounds us. He's a bit of an environmentalist. And so I think that there are ways in which this sort of crosses some of the political boundaries that we currently understand. But it's not that it's not connected. It's quite connected, but it's connected on a deeper level. And so it might seem sort of eclectic. And I can relate to that because, as I said in a previous episode, I feel like I'm sort of eclectic in how I'm digging up different ideas to put together. And so I like this author, and I like the way he does this. I feel an affinity for him. So I'm actually going to jump at this point, oddly, to the very end of the book. Not the absolute end of it, but one of the later chapters when he starts to get toward the present. He talks a little bit about Pat Buchanan and a few others, and then he jumps back in the same section to some of the politicians of the past in the era that we're most concerned with, which is let's say pre-National Review era, that World War II, America First Committee, anti-New Deal, even like 1920s, the anti-League of Nations political coalition. He talks about some of the politicians from that era. And I think it's important for us to know who these guys are because, in a way, they are our intellectual forebears. Nothing that we're doing here in trying to reinvigorate a sort of paleoconservative or nationalist or what have you political stance. We're not necessarily trying to just create something new. I mean, obviously, some of the ideas of the past need to be filtered through the modern, our modern global scenario and so forth. But this is sort of something that we can look to in the past to find inspiration and to find ourselves and our movement connected into the greater tapestry of American history. And so with that, I'm going to read this section. It's a little bit longer. It's not too long, but I think it should help us kind of set our course. He says, quote, "In the fall of 1993, we glimpsed an alternative American political landscape. The terrain was comfortably strange. The topographic features looked familiar, but everything had been moved. And for one brilliant moment, it seemed as if the natural order, the one predating our contemporary helter-skelter, had been restored. The window to this world was opened by the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Thanks to NAFTA, the Democrats, Republicans, liberals, and conservatives split with a smooth, clean break. The nominal leaders of the populist tendencies of right, left, and angry center, Patrick J. Buchanan, Jerry Brown, and Ross Perot, fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The true puzzle then became how it could ever have been otherwise. Our ever-loyal press, famously ignorant of history, panicked at the prospect of revolt by the lowing herd of revenue cows and insisted that this queer coalition was a freakish thing, spectacular but brief and, thank God, unstable. It had been whipped into a frenzy by irresponsible demagogues, and once the dust cleared, the kind would revert to kind. A little rebellion now and then isn't such a bad thing, after all, as long as the dissidents know that it's just a game, and when the morning dawns, they've got to get up and go to work and do their 8-hour stint as cogs in the great wheel of the interdependent global economy. NAFTA was the perfect bugbear for Americanists of all stripes. It sought to cede American jobs, American tax dollars, and American sovereignty to Mexico and multinational corporations and supranational bureaucracies. Its overweening ambition liberated, or exhumed, a body of American nationalists who had been buried with the Bricker Amendment in the 1950s. The Bricker Amendment, the last throaty roar of the old right, had sought to keep the provisions of any treaty from superseding the Constitution. Despite widespread support, the amendment was doomed by the opposition of President Eisenhower and the liberal Democrats who were, almost to a man, still in the giggling stage of infatuation with the Siren Empire. The anti-NAFTA gang of autumn 1993 were the Brickerites with a strong left wing, a potential electoral majority. Is the nightmare alliance of the nativist right and isolationist left, against which William Safire once warned, upon us? There is ample precedent for the aborning America First coalition. Buchanan, Brown, Perot, and their harmonizing band of the bohemian right, patriotic left, and angry center are direct descendants of the old Republican statesmen of the anti-monopolist left and voluntarist right who came together in the 1930s to oppose the fascist thrust of the later New Deal, the National Recovery Administration, the court-packing plan, conscription, and the drift into war and the garrison state. These old Republicans, mistakenly deemed progressives and lumped together with race-improving eugenicists and wealthy New England socialists and war-lusting magazine writers, included Senators Burton K. Wheeler, Gerald P. Nye, Thomas P. Gore, Hiram Johnson, William E. Borah, the junior and senior Robert La Follettes, and the maverick heroes Charles Lindbergh and Major General Smedley Butler. They championed the small against the large, the parochial against the cosmopolitan. Nye made an early splash in North Dakota politics with his heated animadversions against not Wall Street, but those financial centers of the upper Midwest, those havens of sin and usury, the Twin Cities. Nye's side lost. The Kettle Hill Hyde Park side won, and we got 2 world wars, endless dips into distant blood lakes, the dispossession of once independent men, an engorged central government, ever-increasing concentrations of wealth and power, and wholesale violations of individual liberties. It has been, indeed, a rough ride. This was more than just the age-old split between Jefferson and Hamilton, between a minimalist state pursuing a neutral foreign policy and a muscular central government engaged in world affairs. Alexander Hamilton, after all, ghosted a portion of Washington's farewell address, and he fully shared the first president's aversion to entanglements and alliances in overgrown military establishments. The retro-progressives were up against something far more baneful and puissant than subsidy-seeking manufacturers, And though they are gone and forgotten, these desultorily organized defenders of an America that was too big for body bags and too small to fit into a gross national product left stakes that may guide us in redrawing, with sense and clarity, our own political map. Historian Wayne S. Cole, whose life work has been to understand these men, emphasizes that they feared and distrusted bigness of any sort: big business, big finance, big military, big government, big unions, and big corporate farms. Their sympathies were with debtors rather than creditors, with farmers rather than city people, with small businessmen rather than big business, with workers rather than employers, with producers rather than financiers and distributors, with free competition within the country rather than monopoly, with equality of opportunity rather than special privilege, with limited constitutional government rather than monarchy or dictatorship, with legislative authority rather than presidential power, with democracy rather than elitism, with faith in the common man rather than experts, with domestic progress rather than international expansion. Even though libertarians can find much here to admire, the retro-progressives were not dogmatists. Most favored government provision of age-old pensions and emergency public jobs. They viewed the progenitors, and even more the inheritors, of great fortunes with suspicion, and they loathed plutocratic, anti-New Deal front groups, such as the American Liberty League. As Nye scornfully observed, the Economy Leagues and the Liberty Leagues have not yet seen fit to protest the increased appropriations for the Army and the Navy. The party line was healthy heterodoxy. As Tom Fleming and Murray Rothbard have pointed out, there were no commissars to enforce ideological regularity. No one was purged for idiosyncrasy. Borah, for example, supported prohibition. Wheeler was committed to the child labor amendment. Gerald Nye thought FDR too miserly when it came to funding the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps. Many, Wheeler especially, were Roosevelt enthusiasts in 1932, but then their FDR was the Hudson Valley patroon with a demotic streak and a leveling hand, the Grover Cleveland Democrat who, as governor, had decried the tendency to concentrate power at the top of a government structure as alien to our system. The retro-progressives favored, in the words of novelist and farmer Louis Bromfield, free, dispersed, competitive, and cooperative capitalism. The string of qualifying adjectives is crucial. Theirs was a somewhat wistful Jeffersonianism, befitting agrarians and anti-militarists in an increasingly industrial society harnessed to a chugging war economy. Lindbergh asked in 1939, "How long can men thrive between walls of brick, walking on asphalt pavements, breathing the fumes of coal and of oil, growing, working, dying with hardly a thought of wind and sky and fields of grain, seeing only machine-made beauty, the mineral-like quality of life?" End quote. So I like this because he introduces a few of these figures that I think it's important for us to at least know who they are. He goes into them in some more detail. I don't want to nitpick on each one of them, but the main figures that he talks about are Senators Wheeler, Nye, Gore, Johnson, Borah, and LaFollette Jr. and LaFollette Sr. He doesn't mention here Senator Robert Taft, although I think Robert Taft could probably easily fit in with these. He's maybe a little bit later than some of these others, but I think he definitely fits into the mix. But then he mentions Charles Lindbergh and Smedley Butler, neither of whom were politicians per se, but they were both part of this sort of anti-militarist America First mentality. And so I like that that we have these figures to draw on. And then when he talks about the particulars of each of them, essentially you're finding a common thread. The main common thread is an anti-interventionist or a non-interventionist policy, and they were generally fairly comfortable using the term isolationist, which is something that we kind of have allowed to become a pejorative nowadays, particularly through the length of the Cold War, and especially in World War II, the America First Committee's push to stay out of World War II was demonized in many ways. There were, some of the figures maybe didn't express themselves all that well. I know Lindbergh had made some comments about Jews that were considered anti-Semitic, and so that kind of, one speech he gave or something tarred the whole movement. That's not to say that there were not more anti-Semites than just him. But so the concept of isolationists has been kind of a damaged concept. I think it's fair and viable to bring the phrase back rather than allow people who don't support the non-interventionist sort of temperament that I think I support, and paleoconservatives tend to support. Pat Buchanan supports. Most support. Many, Tucker Carlson is a non-interventionist. I think much of the rising nationalist right tends to be non-interventionist. We tend to view the war hawks as neoconservatives. And so I feel like we should just embrace that word and not run from it, and look to the past, to some of the people who have been isolationists in the past. But I think that it's a nice thing where he talks about how their fundamental opposition is to bigness. They're basically for the little guy. That sounds like a cliche, and I guess it is, but it's a decentralized approach to government. It's fairly libertarian, although not dogmatically libertarian. But really like, free competition, free opportunities, and things of that nature. Whatever is going to help the American worker and the American farmer and the American people to thrive and to succeed. So that's sort of the political base there. And then he also, of course, I'd mentioned at the beginning, he introduces this whole thing through NAFTA and the opposition to NAFTA, and Buchanan, Brown, and Perot. Buchanan is the Republican of the batch. He is the one that I'm most interested in, and I've introduced a few books by Buchanan. Well, I've introduced a book by Buchanan. I've got more on the way. And he's come up in previous books, so we'll get more into him. And he talks about Buchanan a little bit in here in more detail. I don't want to get into that right now because, we're going to get more into Buchanan at later times. I want more in this book to get a feel for some of the older figures, and I want to get a feel for some of the aesthetics of how this, because it's not just a set of policies, it's a temperament. This is really kind of rooted in a temperament, and that's why he talks so much in this book about writers and movie producers, but largely writers, and writers who have this sense of place, who are attached to the particular places and the lives of ordinary Americans, and the trials and the tribulations and the hopes and the dreams and the failures and the struggles and all of the parts that make up the lives of ordinary Americans, and that view that as a beautiful thing and something to be celebrated, and not just something to be lost in this glossed over big picture of international trade, international politics, internationalism, globalism, the handing over of American sovereignty to these multinational corporations and multinational political institutions. There's just the kind of a split between this bigger is better and smaller is better perspectives. And the smaller is better perspective cares more about the small town and cares more about the average person. And I think that's what we want to embrace in this new national conservative kind of idea that's currently taking hold. So at this point, now that I've covered that, I want to talk about, I want to jump into the introduction here. There's a section I want to read from the introduction that just provides us with a little bit more detail about the feel of what we're looking for. This is from the introduction, so it's not particular to any person, but helps us get our bearings. He says, quote, "First, let's define these hobgoblin terms populism and isolationism. American populism, in its various guises, has been distinguished by three basic beliefs. 1. Concentrated wealth and power are pernicious. Widespread distribution is the proper condition. 2. War and militarism are ruinous to the republic and to the character, not to mention physical health, of the populace. And 3. Ordinary people can be trusted to make their own decisions. This trio of values has been mangled beyond recognition in establishment historiography. Richard Hofstadter, the laureled historian who, in the paranoid style in American politics, ascribed all dissent from the Cold War consensus to mental illness, sneeringly put it in his The Age of Reform, a 1955 Pulitzer Prize winner, populist thought often carries one into a world in which the simple virtues and unmitigated villainies of a rural melodrama have been projected on a national and even international scale. The excrescences of populist thought include such tendencies in American life as isolationism and the extreme nationalism that usually goes with it, hatred of Europe and Europeans, racial, religious, and nativist phobias, resentment of big business, trade unionism, intellectuals, the Eastern Seaboard, and its culture. This is topsy-turvyism at its most tendentious. It was the populists, after all, who in both world wars opposed exporting bombs and bayonets to massacre Europe and Europeans. Above all, populism is the raw and honest voice of Middle America. It speaks for the Kansas farmer against the Wall Street financer, for the tattered hired hand against the cosmopolitan, for the hard scrabble against the money pit, for us against them. It has been slandered and mauled and buried more times than we can count. In its recurring forms, it has never been tolerated in the way that fringe movements sometimes are, because there is nothing fringe about it. American populism is patriotic and incendiary. When John Lydon of the punk rock group The Sex Pistols snarled, "We mean it, man," his remark encapsulated what makes populism so dangerous. Central to the populist faith was the maintenance of the isolationist foreign policy of the Founding Fathers. To a man, they abjured war and imperialism and the fatiguing phantom of the white man's burden. Isolationist is meant to be an invidious word. Created to smear opponents of war, the term has been rejected by most of its purported exemplars. Nevertheless, the latest generation of isolationists is by and large comfortable with this quondam pejorative. I prefer the word to non-interventionist because it connotes a belief in American exceptionalism, though there are isolationists, for instance, some doctrinaire libertarians, whose devotion to the "where liberty dwells, there is my country" principle precludes any attachment to this land beyond the theoretical. I shall use isolationist to indicate those Americans who believe that the defense policy of the United States ought to be just that, defense, against direct or immediate threats to our territory. This means, in practice, an opposition to 1. Imperialism, which is to say we should not have acquired such spoils of the Spanish-American War as Puerto Rico or the Philippines. 2. Wars or interventions on behalf of international principles, such as World War I, which was to make the world safe for democracy, or at the behest of global political entities, example U.S. participation in United Nations police actions in Somalia, Bosnia, and Lebanon. And 3. Institutions or treaties that transfer U.S. sovereignty to international or multinational bodies, the League of Nations, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and possibly the United Nations. Isolationists have, in the main, opposed U.S. involvement in the Spanish-American War, the First and Second World Wars, the Korea and Vietnam conflicts, the Gulf War, and the various petty invasions of the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Grenada, Haiti, and Panama that have become a staple of 20th century American statecraft. Isolationists are a vigorous, contentious, spirited lot, averse to orthodoxy and witch hunts. There has never been a party line, and various personages have supported the odd war or treaty. In contemporary politics, I apply the term to such disparate figures as Ross Perot, Gore Vidal, and Patrick J. Buchanan, who among them have enough rifts and ruptures to cleave and sink the entire state of California. The classic expression of American isolationism was George Washington's farewell address of September 17, 1796, a statement partly ghosted by Alexander Hamilton. The president counseled, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the world." With foresight, Washington saw that excessive partiality for one foreign nation and excessive dislike of another would lead to a disastrous situation wherein real patriots, who may resist the intrigues of the favorite, are liable to become suspected and odious. President Washington also warned against overgrown military establishments, which, under any form of government, are inauspicious to liberty. A century and a half later, these military establishments had evolved into the huge military-industrial complex against which President Eisenhower cautioned in his own farewell address. The current combined military and foreign assistance budget runs in excess of $300 billion a year, and we are committed to defending more than 40 nations. The last stand of American isolationism, before its remarkable revival in the 1990s, was made by the America First Committee, AFC, in 1940 and 41. The AFC has received such uniformly bad press for half a century that it exists today in the public mind as a rag bag of foaming primitives and goose-stepping German-American beer hall buddies, sprinkled with a pinch of high-toned Mayflower descendants who barred Jews from country clubs. This is a victor's history, complete with demonization of the vanquished foe, and it is absurd. America First was born in September 1940 and died at Pearl Harbor. Dedicated to the proposition that American democracy can be preserved only by keeping out of the European war, the AFC attracted 850,000 card-carrying members and millions more sympathizers, mostly in the Midwest. Its rallies and newsletters amplified anti-war cries of all strains and accents, from socialist Norman Thomas to progressive stalwarts Senator Gerald P. Nye and journalist John T. Flynn, to the greatest American hero, aviator Charles Lindbergh. It was populist and patrician, Main Street and windswept prairie, Exeter and Sauk Center. Financial backers included meatpacking mogul J.C. Hormel and Sterling Morton of the Salt Company. E. Cummings was a card-carrying member, as was Sinclair Lewis. Young America Firsters included John F. Kennedy and Sergeant Shriver, as well as Gerald R. Ford, who, however, resigned when he feared that his activities might cost him his job as assistant football coach at Yale. End quote. So, I like that. We get a little bit of everything there. We get a little bit of a look at the America First Committee, not a deep look, but just kind of a mention that I think it's important that, the modern era is, kind of initiated by Donald Trump is this America First notion, and that's not something that he pulled out of thin air, and it means something, and it can be tracked back to something, and it's not going to be, a lot of people will try to paint this America First movement of the early 1940s as some sort of something rooted in anti-Semitism. I think it's hardly that. It's a sense of isolationism in the sense that we don't need to get involved in everything every other country does. We don't need to have these international treaties that continually bind us to actions and military activities that don't directly affect us. Now, you can go back and forth about the U.S. involvement in World War II, and I think that maybe some of the things that were happening in Europe were just so tragic that it required our involvement, but more generally, the sense of of not involving ourselves in everything that happens all over the world, not being the global policeman, as it were, of every corner of the world. That's something that's important, and we shouldn't just have completely lost that sense of having a reserved, prudent, and perhaps cautious approach to our overseas military activity. There needs to be an anti-war segment of the political population, and I think that we're starting to find that in the nationalist right. And I also like the way that he gets into isolationism and the defense of the terminology. And I also like these 3 points that he makes, particularly these 3 points. Well, he makes 3 points about populism, and he makes 3 points about isolationism. So I'm just going to review those real quick. His 3 points about populism was, first, an opposition to concentrated wealth and power, that both wealth and power should be distributed. And so that means that there's an objection to income inequality, that money shouldn't all just be clustered in certain cities. It shouldn't be clustered in the hands of the quote-unquote 1%, but that a functional society has to have a broad, strong middle class. And if you've got a nation of a few with a lot and many with hardly anything, there is no middle class in that picture. And so a strong middle class is necessary for a strong nation, and that's one of the points of populism. The second one being that war and militarism are ruinous to the republic and the character and physical health of the populace. And that's basically straight up isolationism or non-interventionism or what have you. Really more of a non-intervention because it's specifically an anti-war position, but that ties in with the whole general isolation position. And third, that ordinary people can be trusted to make their own decisions. That's a sort of a libertarian approach right there that says that we don't need to have a government that's going to dictate each and everything, how people are going to spend their money, how charity is going to be managed, how your wages are going to be managed, how your work week is going to be managed, and everything else. It's a kind of leave people alone sort of mentality and don't get all up in their business all the time about everything. There's a certain libertarian aspect to that, and so there is a manner in which populism and libertarianism can be compatible. And that's one thing that actually drives me crazy about modern political thought, is that we've got to subdivide ourselves into all these different areas of thought. Whether you're a libertarian, or you're not libertarian enough, you've got to be a pure libertarian, you've got to be a pure nationalist, you've got to be a pure populist, you've got to be blah, 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 blah. And we're all going to separate ourselves into our corners, and nobody's going to have any more good ideas because they're striving toward this kind of shallow purity rather than a more complex picture that finds the underlying connections between all what each of these different political factions has to say that has some value. I think that's more nuanced and more mature approach. So anyway, let's move on to the next section. I want to mention just a few of the figures that he talks about in this book. First, I'm going to mention a character by the name of Hannibal Hamlin Garland, who is an author. And I don't want to say too much about him, but he just has a sort of an aesthetic sense of home and place that's important to him, and what makes him a part of this book, and that we can kind of take something from. So what does he say about Hamlin Garland? Not too much here that I want to quote, but just this part here. He says, quote, "He was a staunch Jeffersonian, a believer in widespread distribution of private property, a decentralized and minimal state, and individual liberty as opposed to the socialistic ideal. Yet Garland parted company with the sage of Monticello on one critical issue. While he detested paternalistic government, he preached Henry George's doctrine of common land ownership." Henry George's doctrine, end quote. Henry George's doctrine was really simple. It's just exactly like it says, common land ownership, and sort of a modern iteration of this is the land value tax, where property is taxed at the rate of the value of the land rather than the building that sits upon that land. And so that theoretically would create a situation where people aren't discouraged from updating their houses. Sometimes slumlords will let their houses go to allow their property values to decline in order to keep their property tax levels low. So that's something to think about. I haven't studied it well enough to have a real solid opinion on it, but in some sense it seems like it makes sense to me. But then he says more about this figure. He says that, he mentions a book that Hamlin Garland had written called The Arena, and he says, in The Arena, he says, quote, "In The Arena, Garland explained the populist creed. We are individualists, mainly. Let that be understood at the start. We stand unalterably opposed to the paternal idea in government. We believe in fewer laws and the juster interpretation thereof. As president of the Boston Anti-Poverty League, he strenuously opposed government ownership of railroads, arguing that we are advancing along the lines of absolute freedom, and it is not freedom to put into governmental hands the running of trains. Garland's anti-monopolism carried him so far as to bemoan the absence of competition in mail delivery." And obviously there's more that he talks about. He actually, kind of interesting part, he brings up another individual by the name of Donnelly, a Minnesota congressman, who was also an author. And this is back in the day, 1890, he wrote a book called Caesar's Column. And I just thought it was kind of interesting thing here. This is like I was talking about. He jumps around from person to person. But he mentions Donnelly in this. This is all in the populist movement. I mean, Garland, I guess I should explain this more. Garland was a populist. Not only was he a writer, but he wrote speeches for the Populist Party that was in the late 1800s. And also continued on into the early 1900s, but fizzled out around there. But he says, quote, "In his dystopian novel, Caesar's Column, from 1890, Donnelly envisions an America of 1988, in which the government owns all the guns, newspapers are simply the hired mouthpieces of power, and a stunted, mongrelized workforce toils for multinational megacorporations until the peons commit suicide by the pleasantest means possible, and their corpses are burned in the huge furnaces that rage all through the night. We are a republic in name, free only in forms," shouts one radical. Yet the author asserted, "We have but to expand the powers of government to solve the enigma of the world." Certainly a Garlandian libertarianism did not constitute the whole of agrarian populism. In Donnelly's novel, still a fast and exciting read, by the way, similar to Jack London's The Iron Heel, we see in stark outline the populist boogeyman. Overweening and meddlesome government determined to stamp out dissent, corporate media that are handmaidens to the state, large, rootless financial interests that profit from war, the defenselessness of farmers, laborers, and small businessmen, and the alloying of the American population through immigration and annexation, end quote. And so some of these boogeymen that he describes of the populist movement, what they were fighting against, we can kind of see some of those same things today. So the modern populist right, particularly, is going to see a lot of these same things as the modern enemies. And there was, now, the populist movement of the late 1800s was not entirely considered a right-wing movement. It was really more considered a left-wing progressive movement, but it was, things weren't defined quite so clearly back then as they are now. I don't think they had quite the same strict division, so there was a libertarian aspect to it all. But there was also a populist common man sort of progressivism that was in it as well. But the enemies that they kind of lay out, the meddlesome government determined to stamp out dissent. Well, what do we see a lot of people on the right trying to get this overweening and meddlesome government back into the bottle, if you will, back constrained, small enough to drown in a bathtub, as it's been said. So the big government is the opponent of the old school populism, and the big corporate rootless financial interests profiting from war. And there's a large opposition in the populist movement to this endless immigration that drives down wages and annexation of new territories, I should say. So that section gives a bit of a rundown of what the populist movement back then was like. Hopefully we'll get a chance to go into more detail about that in future books. But then he talks about another character who's not a populist, but still represents a bit of this America First sort of movement. And this is a person who is actually a wealthy individual, a patrician, as he says. His name was Amos Pinchot, and he largely railed against the New Deal, and he railed against World War II, I believe. Actually, no, I'm sorry. It was a little earlier than that. He railed against the New Deal largely. That was kind of his main thing, but he's also very much an anti-war figure, like everyone detailed in this book. So I'm going to read a little bit about him. He says, quote, "Like all good obstreperous Americans, Pinchot hated coercion. He was a voluntarist, not a socialist, and he understood monopoly and imperialism to be twin menaces to the Republic. As a Jeffersonian, he idealized human-scale competitive enterprise and the widespread distribution of wealth and political power. He hated bigness of any sort. Otis L. Graham, Jr. wrote in his excellent study, The Old Progressives and the New Deal, Amos Pinchot was a courageous individualist for whom reform meant a battle against size. In his several roles, as a libertarian, a eulogist of small-scale democracy, a foe of militarism, and a critic of a governing class that he believed had become very nearly an occupying army, Amos R. E. Pinchot was the complete and prototypical America Firster. Better than anyone, except perhaps A. J. Nock in our time, he was a precursor of the libertarian movement," writes historian Arthur A. Eckarch. The libertarian pedigree is obvious in Amos's defense of the masses' right to publish, his co-founding of the ACLU, and his conviction that the New Deal carried the seeds of dictatorship. It is seemingly eclipsed, however, by his advocacy of government ownership of railroads and utilities. Even at his most unlibertarian, in calling for public ownership of the railroads, Pinchot invoked his favorite professor, individualist sociologist Billy Sumner, and said that he was only trying to keep equal chance alive. The largest financial interests were using the iron horse to destroy free competitive industry. The industro-financial baronage that controlled transportation was fixing prices and driving out competitors. The railroads, with their massive land grants and subsidies, had largely been a creation of the Gilded Age. The resultant octopus concentrates wealth, concentrates power, and results in the defeat of democratic theory. Only the untried expedient of public ownership could restore the pre-monopoly competitive economy that had built America. We must make transportation and raw materials accessible to all on even terms, Pinchot argued. That is why I advocate government ownership of railroads and natural resources. He saw as the challenge of the day to break the power of the monopolistic groups, reestablish competitive industrial life, and restore in production, distribution, and politics the equal chance. To this end, Pinchot urged Teddy Roosevelt unsuccessfully to advocate steep reductions in tariffs. End quote. So he's not per se a populist. He lived a little bit later than Garland, but he's very much a libertarian with this one particular exception, but his goal is free competition. His goal is to give working people a fighting chance to compete in a free market and be able to make their way without being dominated by these massive corporations that control all of the resources, all of the distribution methods, and kind of have these small farmers and small businesses under their thumb. So we kind of start to get this coalition, if you will, of different interests that make up the America First movement. It's very libertarian, it's very populist, and it's very much rooted in concern for the working class and small business. And the smallness, like was said previously about the senators, a concern for the small against the big, and the local and the distinct and the particular. So another person I want to mention is Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who was Teddy Roosevelt's daughter, who was apparently quite the wild child, and interestingly considered herself a pagan and continually criticized Christianity, which was interesting. She actually buried some sort of a idol or something on the White House lawn to hex the incoming Taft administration. Well, probably the first time anyone's ever tried to cast a spell on the White House lawn. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Anyway, so a little bit about Alice. I'll just read this section here. It's not particularly long. He says, quote, "In 1920, Alice supported an unprepossessing family friend, General Leonard Wood, for the Republican presidential nomination, although she was also fond of her father's bull moose running mate, California Senator Hiram Johnson, whose campaign theme was his 100% Americanism. He did not mean by this a petty xenophobia or insistence upon loyalty oaths that no real patriot would ever dream of signing. Rather, Johnson upheld fidelity to one's little corner of the world. Johnson's platform was normalcy itself. It is time for an American policy, he declared in 1919. Bring home American soldiers, rescue our own democracy, restore its free expression, get American business into its normal channels, let American life, social and economic, be American again. Although he polled the most primary votes, Johnson's bid fell short, as did Wood's. Alice withheld the endorsement of the Sagamore Hill Roosevelts until eventual Republican nominee Warren G. Harding, whom she liked as a poker pal but dismissed as a lightweight, promised a hardline anti-League stance. Alice roared through the 1920s, carrying a flask of bootleg bourbon and a copy of the Constitution in her capacious purse. Bora sounded at times like her father as he denounced this weakening, simpering, sentimental internationalism which would destroy national character and undermine nationalism, and insisted upon the cultivation of an American mind, an American purpose, and American ideals. This was Rooseveltian phraseology in service of an anti-Rooseveltian program. I am a Republican with a progressive tradition inclination, Alice said in 1932. She deplored lavish federal spending and drastic federal control of business and agriculture, and most of all, any diminution of American sovereignty. Her progressivism was the forgotten kind, that of Amos R.E. Pinchot and the nation's William Hard and the New Jersey dynamo George Record. It stood for parsimonious expenditure, for equal rights for all, special privileges for none, for the destruction of monopoly by democratically controlled local governments, and for the founders' coiled rattlesnake foreign policy of armed neutrality. That this progressive tradition was completely at odds with her father's never seemed to cross Alice's mind. End quote. So what we've got here is, there's a couple things packed in here, but there's a sort of a split between the progressivism of Teddy Roosevelt and the progressivism of his daughter. She calls herself a Republican with a progressive tradition inclination, but what she describes as her progressivism is not especially the progressivism of, say, Woodrow Wilson, and the implementation of the expert bureaucracy and the sort of anti-democratic administrative state that was pushed as a progressive reform. Her progressivism didn't really look like that. It was a much more libertarian, cutting back on lavish federal spending, cutting back on drastic federal control of business and agriculture, but also the destruction of monopoly, sort of a coiled rattlesnake foreign policy of armed neutrality. So that's sort of a peace through strength, but not interfering with other nations or aligning with other nations, just the coiled rattlesnake. I like that kind of. We see that in the Tread on Me, the Don't Tread on Me Gadsden flag, but it's sort of international military approach that says, don't start no trouble, won't be no trouble type of thing. Anyway, she's interesting. She's got the flask of bootleg bourbon in her purse. I think that kind of exemplifies. She's known as having a acidic wit, and the reference to President Harding, which she didn't endorse Republican nominee Warren G. Harding until he promised a hardline anti-League stance. That's the League of Nations that Wilson was trying to push, and that the Republicans held at bay. And that was another attempt to bring the United States into these international arrangements. She was very concerned with American sovereignty, and so she was deeply, deeply opposed to the League of Nations. At a later point, I'm not going to read, but it does describe at a later point, she is very involved with the America First Committee. She's, I believe, the New York chairperson of the America First Committee. And so she's really opposed in many ways to FDR's policies. She's opposed to the New Deal. She's opposed to the war in Europe, or participation of the war in Europe. I think she's a really interesting character. Someone who I wouldn't mind reading some more about at some point. But right now, I'm going to move on. He talks about a couple of other people, and I just want to hit on one more person who I like the way he describes, and that is this last section where he talks about Jack Kerouac. And I think this is cool. Obviously, Jack Kerouac was never a politician, was never active in politics. And I've kind of focused, as I've been discussing this, I've kind of focused on people's different political activities or their political persuasions. And I haven't really talked as much about the aesthetic stuff. Like, I skipped over most of the writers that he talks about. But I just want to hit on this one part here because I think it's important to recognize that that in understanding what he refers to as Americanism, there's a broad spectrum of different types of people who reach out for this notion and try to embody it and express it. And we can get a lot from all sorts of characters to understand what it is to be an American and to value Americans. And it's not just a matter of policy. It's a matter of what you value in your day-to-day life. So he says, quote, "Has there ever been a character as breathless as Dean Moriarty? Right at the beginning of the novel, fresh out of reform school, babbling nonstop about Nietzsche and fast cars and the meaning of life, he enters the bookish New York world of Kerouac alter ego, Sal Paradise, and leads Paradise and his friends on a series of wild trips across the country and into Mexico. Moriarty's reckless enthusiasm for life infects Paradise with the wanderlust, not as an expression of aimlessness, but because there's just so damn much to see and feel in this country. What is mundane and dreary to so many sad folks is, to Moriarty and his pupil Paradise, pure joy. A trip to the corner store becomes the occasion of an epiphany, a revelation of how rich and sweet our lives can be. Paradise walks into a Nebraska diner, haggard and hungry, and meets euphoria. Quote, I heard a great laugh, the greatest laugh in the world. And here came this rawhide, old-timer Nebraska farmer, with a bunch of other boys, into the diner. You could hear his raspy cries clear across the plains, across the whole gray world of that day. Everyone else laughed with him. He didn't have a care in the world and had the hugest regard for everybody. I said to myself, wham, listen to that man laugh. That's the West. Here I am in the West. It was the spirit of the West, sitting right next to me. I wish I knew his whole raw life and what the hell he'd been doing all these years, besides laughing and yelling like that. Hooey, I told my soul. End quote. The passage is typical of the book, a yelping, loving ode to America. The cowboy deity Moriarty enters Paradise's slate-gray world, helps him to dig the spirit of the West, then takes his leave, walking alone into the dark American night. American men have forever set out for the frontier, fleeing the cozy coffin of domesticity, Sal and Dean were Huck and Jim. In a few years, they would be Wyatt and Billy on motorcycles, racing through the barren beauty of the Southwest in Easy Rider, counseling strangers about the wisdom of doing your own thing in your own time, and ultimately paying the price that post-war America exacts for dissent. Always in America there remains, from pioneer days, a cheerful pariahdom of shabby young men who prowl causelessly from state to state, from gang to gang in the power of the wanderlust. Sinclair Lewis wrote in Aerosmith, and all the Beats were really doing is upholding the honor of tramps in a world run by Robert McNamara and his brethren in their gray flannel suits. Kerouac claimed to have written On the Road, on Benzedrine and booze over a 3-week period in 1951. The gestation was much longer. It was rejected by publisher after publisher until in 1957 Viking took a chance on the now despondent, penniless King of the Beats. The day after the novel's publication, the New York Times featured an effusive review by Gilbert Milstein calling the book's appearance a historic occasion. Fame, and for a time, fortune followed. Linked with Howl, Allen Ginsberg's blow against the Moloch Empire, On the Road was a cry for a revolutionary atavism, a return to the America of vagabonds and Indians and the fellow feeling that flowed through Whitman's word torrents. A handful of good young writers, notably Norman Mailer, recognized the Beats as kindred souls and rallied to their defense. Others, including Gore Vidal, admired their energy but disliked their literary output. As Truman Capote memorably said of Kerouac's prose, "That's not writing, that's typewriting." Like Michael Myers in the Halloween series or the hockey-masked Jason in Friday the 13th, some villains keep regular hours. You can set your watch by their leaps from the shadows, rusty shivs in hand, ready to stick the knife in whatever is true or beautiful or American. Enter critic Norman Podhoretz, then doggedly climbing the ladder of success. The Beats are hostile to civilization, he charged in 1958. The suppressed cry he detected in Kerouac was positively homicidal. Kill the intellectuals who can talk coherently, and these poet laureates of juvenile delinquency were poised to take over the country. But what if the Beats had taken over the country? Most shunned politics, unlike their patron saint Whitman, who began his career as a militantly free-trade newspaper editorialist aligned with the laissez-faire wing of the Jacksonian democracy, the Loco Focos. Allen Ginsberg, whose mother was a communist, is a kind of leftist libertarian whose mantra is, "I don't like the government where I live." He is also part of the Jewish bohemian tradition that has enriched American anarchism. William S. Burroughs is a gun-toting anarchist whose favorite political writer is the Pat Buchanan of the 1940s, the dukes-up polemical brawler Westbrook Pegler. And Kerouac was, from the start, an anti-war Taft Republican. He believed in a conservative working-class America, writes Beat publisher John Montgomery. He liked Ike, baseball, the Virgin Mary, Buddha, and apple pie. Indeed, he did like Ike, but Kerouac preferred Robert Taft for the Republican presidential nomination. The collected letters of Allen Ginsberg and Neal Cassady are amusing on this point. Ginsberg is avid for liberal Illinois Senator Paul Douglas to receive the Democratic nomination in 1952, and he complains that Jack is solid for Taft. Kerouac also seems to have approved of Senator Joseph McCarthy. He regarded communism as un-American, and while his pacifist isolationism led him to oppose the Cold War and Vietnam, he wanted his America purged of this European impurity. Montgomery, fictionalized as Henry Morley in Kerouac's The Dharma Bums, tells me that Kerouac even took a stab, unsuccessfully, at reading the libertarian novelist Ayn Rand. He did, however, enjoy National Review. When its editor, William F. Buckley Jr., had him as a guest on his TV show Firing Line, the host was nasty and condescending, and unable to understand how Kerouac could be, at once, against the Vietnam War, deeply respectful of American servicemen, contemptuous of literary communists, and of the opinion that the hippies are good kids. These views are in perfect harmony, as any American understands, which is why the cosmopolitan Buckley didn't. But to the beats, politics was just so soulless. The duty of the public man, after all, is to put reins on wild, self-believing individuals. There is no room in the Young Socialist League or the college Republicans for the T. Gerards or the Dean Moriartys of this world. Kerouac's faith reposed not in the men who pretended to shoot Liberty Valance, but in men who actually did, in his beloved America, the land from which he drew his voice. Writer Jack McClintock sketches the gentle patriotism of a man supposedly hostile to civilization itself. Quote, Kerouac once told us of a party of Ken Kesey's in New York, at which Ginsberg came up and rapped Jack's shoulders with an American flag, with obvious satiric intent. So I took it, he showed how he took it, and the movements were tender. And I folded it up, the way you're supposed to, and I put it on the back of the sofa. The flag is not a rag. End quote. A couple of years after that party, on October 21st, 1969, Jack Kerouac died. The pressures of sudden fame had sapped his vitality and driven him off the road long before. By the end of his life, he was a bloated alcoholic, living in Florida with his wife and doting mother. Kerouac had published 19 books, relaying with varying degrees of success the unspeakable visions of one individual. His finest, On the Road, belongs in the canon of great American and great Americanist novels. Kerouac's body lies in a small Catholic cemetery in Lowell, visited now and then by those of us who cherish his memory, and the America that was and can be again. His epitaph reads, "He honored life." And he did. End outer quote. So that was a little bit of a long section there about Jack Kerouac, but it's nice to step away from the deeply political for a minute, and just take a moment to recognize the writers and the people, the thinkers, the iconoclasts, the rebels, the wide range of regular people and crazy people who are exploring and defining what it is to be an American and breaking the bounds and really digging deep into their souls and into the soul of this country, oftentimes unappreciated for the work that they do, and shining the light on those others of us who are unappreciated in our day-to-day lives. And I like that. I think America is a beautiful place, and I think the American people are beautiful. And so it's nice to take a moment to recognize those of us who are willing to say that out loud and write it down. So that's going to wrap up my show for today. That was America First by Bill Kauffman. You can find me on Facebook and on Twitter and on Patreon. Those are some areas where I frequent. I'm actually not on Patreon that much, but I have it there because I'm always looking for some support with the show so that I can get the stuff that I need and maybe put a little bit of money into promoting the show and getting it out there for the rest of the world, for the rest of America to enjoy. So that will wrap me up today. I hope you have a wonderful day, whatever it is you are doing, and I will catch you on the flip side. Later.